Chapter 591. The war is about to begin. The viewers would always remember Yiga King, who had won the duel but still chose to die at the hands of his opponent. They would also remember Xuanhuan, who had transcended in the duel and became a sword god. The ultimate radiance shown in the duel dazzled everyone. Regardless if they were showing off or not, people gathered in the open space before the shops. Obviously, this movie inspired the players, and they didn't want to wait and waste this moment. The cultivators and warriors all ran out of the shops. Song Qingfeng said, "Please." Lin Xiao said with a straight face, "Not now." "Why not?" Song Qingfeng was so expressionless that the audience's faces twitched. "Because your mind is not at peace," Lin Xiao said with great dignity. "If your mind is troubled, your sword techniques will be disturbed, which will undoubtedly lead to your death. Trash. Watch my flying immortal beyond the heavens." Xuanhuan couldn't watch it anymore. While some people acted out the scenes from the movie in a terrible manner, others were serious and savored their inspirations. Nalan Hongwu had indeed obtained many inspirations. He moved his black sword slowly as if he were imitating something. He seemed to have found a special rhythm. Meanwhile, Zhongwu, Liang Hayu, and other warriors were also savoring the perfect sword strike in the movie. As for the cultivators, they were savoring the perfect control of swords, their own strength, essence, and everything that they could put in use. Regardless of how much they could understand, they had obtained tremendous growth. In the distant, primitive snow-covered land to the west of the spiritual state lived a group of strong and proud people. They kept company with huge dragons and living in ice and frost. They had built a nation in the chilly high mountains in the ancient times, and their descendants lived there until today. But today, they faced destruction when the black lightning bolts tore open the sky. The city built on the high snow mountain looked like it was made of ice. Right now, holes were everywhere, and there was only the scene of devastation. In the huge ice snow palace on the peak of the highest mountain stood a man with an imposing figure. At first glance, people would think that he was a giant. He was wearing red armor and was holding a huge dragon-headed saber that was almost as tall as himself. Standing on the huge platform, people could see the distant snow mountains. A dark blue stone palace engulfed in pale blue light patterns hovered in the sky, and strange stone array discs flew around it. Strange spiritual lights flowed around the huge and ancient round array discs, while many spiritual patterns containing spiritual power blinked on them. When they blinked, holy light beams shot down from the sky and turned into destructive magic light, shattering the ground and destroying the cities. "Your Majesty." A middle-aged general who was covered in blood bowed to him. "We can't block them. Please evacuate this place now." The huge man didn't answer. This should be the liveliest moment of the day in this beautiful city built on ice, but it felt like the doomsday today. It seemed like the roars could shake the ground. In a distant mountain, a huge blood-red horned dragon let out a great roar. "This is the land that we've lived on for thousands of years." The man in red armor was once the strongest Grand Emperor warrior on the continent. After getting onto his blood dragon, he charged into the sky. Compared with the destructive shadow in the sky, the huge horned dragon looked very tiny. Perhaps today was really their doomsday. The ultimate West realm wasn't the only place that was under siege. Meanwhile, like an immortal relic, a fiery red palace hovered in the high sky above the small human nation in the Morning Star Sea realm. Situated in the very depth of the continent, Xuan's Hong Manor and Yuxu Mountain had never imagined that disaster would strike them so harshly. Today, many flames crashed onto the mountains like meteors, destroying all the spiritual essence in the factions and turning their garden of abundant spiritual plants into scorched land. At this moment, the spiritual spell visual projection had begun. With its great force almost covering more than half of the nations on the continent, the Judgment Godly Palace even had churches and followers in the Morning Light Empire. Even some of the royal members of the Morning Light Empire believed in the gods of Judgment Godly Palace. Due to the great development of information technology in this world, All kinds of magic items entered people's everyday life. Even civilians in the city could gather on the central square of Kanglan City to watch the spiritual spell visual projection cast by the priests of Judgment Godly Palace. In the center of the square, the light emitting from the magic crystal soon condensed into a screen. Miss Salah, I understand that you dislike wars. Am I right? A knight of the Golden Griffin Knight Legion saw the short elf girl who had silver hair and was wearing green leather armor when he got here. Different from you, I'm here to see when the war will end, the elf girl said. Oh, I don't wish for the war to begin since it will cause many people to suffer. Almighty elf god, please end this war as soon as possible. Miss Salah, you're a kind person. If they hand over Carl, Jessica, and Kevin, I think the war will end very soon, the knight said with a snort. Meanwhile, Jessica was eating melon on a couch in Xuanhuan City shop, and she exclaimed, "What? They are here? Xina, get me a bottle of iced red tea and a bag of potato chips." She was afraid that she wouldn't be able to have such delicacies after returning home. Oh. Coming. Carl said immediately, "Get me a bottle of red tea too." Of course. The war wasn't waged just because of the three of them. But clearly, the flames of war continued to spread. In the spiritual spell visual projection, people saw a middle-aged man who was about 40 years old explaining the current situation in the war. This man had dark skin and short brown hair that was neatly combed to two sides, and he wore a black military uniform. As an ambassador from the Radiant Light Godly Nation, Luther was proficient with this work. He talked with ease while watching the war. Now, we are seeing the battlefield in that continent. As you can see, our three forces had gained footholds on this continent. These weak natives couldn't fight back at all. Let's first look at the battlefield in the west of the continent. We've captured the Blood Dragon Grand Emperor warrior of the Ultimate West Realm. Yes, you heard it right. Oh, it's unbelievable. Is he really the ruler of this world? He's so weak. Of course. Our fighters are the strongest. Chapter 592, Internet Cafe Army. Roll out, Princess, Your Highness. The old man wearing a white priest robe bowed, inviting the woman to sit down on the chair at the head of the table. This woman wore a luxurious, fiery red long dress and an exquisite silver crown, looking extremely beautiful from every angle. However, everyone knew that it was just her image projection. Princess Isabella, who had the most noble legendary bloodline, wouldn't come in person. Sitting beside her was the famous Street Hines. Besides these two powerful figures, other powerful figures from the Radiant Light Godly Nation and other godly nations sat in the palace. The image projection of the old man who had visited the Guardian of Wind also sat among them. Grand Emperor Warrior? One of these prestigious existences frowned. Like ants, they don't know how big the world is and how weak they are. They also have no idea that there are always stronger people out there, which is why they gave themselves such lofty titles. The old man laughed heartily. It's you, Mr. Street Hematon, the world mage, another existence said. Before them, the scene turned to another place under the control of the spiritual spell visual projection. These are the legendary three saint factions on this continent. Behind these grand palaces, we can see Yuxi Mountain, one of the three saint factions. Oh, I can't believe it. I thought it would be a hard battle. How dare such a weak faction call themselves saints? It seems that I must agree with you, Mr. Street Hematon. A figure engulfed in golden light said, "It's a shame that such an existence dares to use the title of saint." The figure shook his head in disdain. Oh, what are we looking at? This human nation is so weak. Their king, oh my god, the strongest master of this nation is equivalent to a level 5 fighter here. Only level 5. It's unbelievable. I'm sorry for my outburst. What I wanted to say is that only uncivilized land can create such a nation. Then the scene turned to the deserted sea realm. Oh, it's unbelievable. At this moment, Joseph, CIA, and other young people were also watching the spiritual spell visual projection while sitting on the bench on the edge of the square. With disbelief in their eyes, They listened to Ambassador Luther's explanations and saw how deluded the people in that land were about their own abilities and importance. How can they think this way? Oh, it's hard to imagine how they can live in such a world. It's horrifying. I hope they will be saved so that we can see the redemption of this world. Meanwhile, in the Xuanhuan city shop, a young man with red-brown hair was busy playing Dungeon Fighter online. He was Gabriel. Suddenly, he slammed his hand on the desk and shouted, "FCK, our home is being attacked." He actually spoke fluent spiritual state language. Then, more warriors of the ultimate West realm jumped up from their chairs. "Brothers, grab your weapons and go." Gabriel yelled, "Bring more colorless crystals, more colorless crystals. FCK, where's the disassembler? Disassemble more of them. I'll get some more spiritual artifacts and toss them in." Meanwhile, Xuanhuan was practicing sword techniques outside the shop. Dumbfounded, he watched the uproar among the warriors of Ultimate West Realm and wondered, what's going on? Bad news. Elder Yu ran into the internet cafe in alarm. "Everyone, the catastrophe is about to strike the spiritual state now." What catastrophe? Last time they claimed that it would come in 3 months, but nothing has happened after such a long time had passed. Xuanhuan shouted back, "What catastrophe are you talking about?" "Academy Master has foreseen a greater catastrophe coming our way. Those existences, they are coming for real." Elder Yu said in a loud voice. "What? How come nothing came from the heavenly abyss sea?" "They attacked from the ultimate West realm." Right now, there were almost 10,000 players in the shop from all over the region. There were more who hadn't come into the shop yet. Groups of warriors and cultivators exited from the games and stood up while slamming the desk. Meanwhile, in the Jua City shop, the street outside the shop was crammed with cultivators and warriors. There were more in the shop. The purple-robed Taoist of Xuanhuan Manor and the old man of Yuxi Mountain stumbled out the shop with communication jades in their hands, almost spewing blood on the door. "No, those people are attacking from the direction of our factions." "What?" Jiwu was practicing sword techniques outside the shop. He was the emperor. But maintaining his warrior strength was quite important, which was why he spent hours on cultivation and practice each day. "This time, we're in it together. We must unite and work in consolidation." The two faction masters felt like crying. "Why are the enemies attacking our factions first? And we are here in the internet cafe." They cussed silently in frustration. "Don't worry, Faction Master Wang." Lanmo thought for a moment, knowing that it wasn't time to uphold personal grudges. And Huai said, "Where is the Zhou army?" At this moment, Deputy Commander Gong He was still playing The Legend of Mia 2. In the game, a warrior was chasing after a wizard while holding a huge and heavy saber. "You dare to run? Run more." On the screen, a huge white spiritual sword crashed down viciously. "Watch my sky opening strike." Boom. "Ha ha ha ha. You can't run now, huh? With my 40-meter-long big saber, I can let you run for 39 meters. Then, this man put down the virtual reality headset and shouted, "Juami, Juami." Standing beside Nalan Hongwu, Elder Fu cupped his hands. "My lord." "Okay." Nalan Hongwu stroked his snow-white beard and stood as he withdrew his sword. "It's time." In the half-city shop, sitting at the counter, Zemo slightly closed his eyes and seemed to see a strange scene. He froze. "No, Sister Ruan Ning, they are here." "What do you mean they are here?" Mo Tanxing asked as he sat on the couch. "Aha, I calculated with my fingers." A mass of black mist floated down from the second floor. "You're all in danger." Ning Bai immediately stood up from her chair and gave it a hard look. Smirking face emoji. "You'll be the first to be sacrificed if we're in trouble." She frowned. "They are here." "Where's my great internet cafe army?" "Here." The cultivators and warriors in the shop answered. Row after row of cultivators and warriors stood up from their seats. Tang Yuan said, "I'm tired of killing abyss demons 100 times a day. It's great for us to fight for real to change it up." Black Demon said, "Let's go. Come on, let's nail them." Mr. Fang sent a message in the group chat, "Some people are making trouble for us. Homies. Gatino added, Internet Cafe Army. Rollout. Internet Cafe Army. Rollout. Internet Cafe Army. Rollout. Messages instantly flooded the screen. Chapter 593, The Rumored Battling in Suits. Info note. Battling in suits is a meme in China. In a TV show, a girl said that all DFO players were fat otaku, so all DFO players rallied up. A lot of DFO players and streamers dressed up in suits to play the game. At this moment, the forces of the two families divided into three groups and gained footholds on this continent. In their eyes, this would be a landslide victory. They had made a detailed war plan just to achieve a perfect victory. Have you scouted out the routes? As the commander, Alex directed this battle in person. Despite the weak strength of their enemies, he was well prepared. Yes, we have. The guard presented him a map on which the red lines marked their direction of attack. Even the forces along the route and their strength had been figured out and reported. They could see that from the three saint factions toward Heavenly Abyss Sea, the strength of the forces dropped. These barbaric natives don't know that we can see them as clearly as if they are lights in the night. Meanwhile, outside the north border of Darjan Dash, all kinds of huge spiritual ships were parked on the vast desert. By now, these spiritual ships had been improved many times after they exchanged spiritual ship production processes with the Gongshu family and the cultivators of spiritual state. These spiritual ships were much more powerful than the old version. In the Ultimate West Realm Dash, it seemed like doomsday had come for these people of the Ultimate West Realm. The homeless people of the Ultimate West Realm were either captured or hiding in the bitter cold snow mountains, waiting for a chance to fight back. At this moment, almost all the prisons in the region were full of captives, and it wasn't enough. Many warriors of the Ultimate West Realm were forced to take off their armor. In tattered dirty clothes and chained, they kneeled on the snow-covered square of Snow Peak City, the biggest city in the Ultimate West Realm. With their cultivation strength sealed by that mysterious force, their bare feet and hands were frozen and turned purple. Even though these warriors had been born and raised in this bitter environment, it was hard for them to withstand this harsh cold without cultivation strength. The huge magical stone palace hovered in the sky, casting a huge shadow and almost engulfing the whole Snow Peak City. For the residents, this was the most terrifying nightmare that they had in the past thousands of years. It must be noted that Taiyui, the title that Carl used in the beginning, was a translation for regime after he had learned the spiritual state language with a spiritual spell. On this other land where people used the ancient godly language, this word meant God of radiant light judgment, who controlled the rise and fall of the two suns and had the right to judge other gods. All the lofty members of the godly palace were proud of their radiant and esteemed image. Luther was especially attentive to his image. Before he appeared in a public place, he would spend 1 to 2 hours to groom himself. In a shadowy place outside the White Pigeon Square in Shizkanglan City, two figures stood while wearing dark grey cloaks. Obviously, they didn't like to be exposed in sunlight. Ambassador Luther of the Radiant Light Godly Nation is just a dog to the Judgment Godly Palace. Oh. He's just a clown. A complete clown. Look at his disgusting face while he shows off in the spiritual spell image projection. Damn it. I want to throw dog SHT on his face and tear his dirty mouth into pieces. However, Luther didn't pay any attention to such insults because these people were as low as the mice and bugs living in the slums and sewers. However, if such words reached him, some people would be in big trouble. I remember that someone once asked me if lowly and corruptive existences still are around under the God's light. I thought that there was only one kind of such beings who hide in the filth in darkness. Even the God can't save them. He continued after a pause, oh, I think you know whom I'm referring to. They wear filthy clothes, emit a stinky odor, and inhabit the dirtiest spots, such as in the sewers. Now, I think that the barbaric natives are as low as them. At this moment, the visual shown by the spiritual spell displayed a small nation in the Morning Star Sea realm. Look at this humble and pathetic nation. Even the strongest masters are only at level 5. Ho ho. but I still hope that the god's radiance will shine on this land as soon as possible. Oh, what do we see? At this moment, they had a glimpse of a line of black shadows in the distant horizon. The black shadows moved forward swiftly through the clouds beyond the northern snow mountains to the west of the spiritual state. The barbaric natives are coming to us? Even in the Grand Palace where powerful masters gathered with street hinds, many of them looked surprised. Ha, they dare to attack? I thought that they would defend that sea area. At least by concentrating their forces, they might be able to struggle and fight back for a bit. Land of Thorns is personally guarding this godly palace, and 6 Sky Knights and 3 prophets of the Thornflower family are also here. They are all level 9 supermasters. These natives dare to come to us? Get the destruction scale magic cannon ready. In the fancy central hall of that grand palace, a man who was wearing a luxurious black robe with golden patterns sat on his seat. Before him stood 9 people in 2 rows, emitting suffocating presences. They were the 6 Sky Knights and 3 prophets of the Thornflower family. It's time to give the ignorant natives a taste of our power. Born in the reclusive cultivator community in 7 Cent Mountain, Fairy King Yun was not good at fighting. However, not all cultivators who weren't great at combat were useless in war. Fairy King Yun excelled in making elixirs, spiritual treasures, supporting spiritual spells, and even calculation techniques. Although she had been idle lately, she watched The Legend of the White Snake every day. While she watched Bai Susan calculating and seeing people's previous lives and the future of Little King and others, Fairy King Yun obtained more inspiration, and her calculation technique improved. Now, she only needed to do a calculation with her fingers to know anyone's position and conditions and even the layout of forces in a certain area. Despite her lack of combat abilities, she was stationed on the flagship ship. She felt proud of herself. They are really getting close. Luther sounded disdainful. At this range, we can put the spiritual spell closer to them, so we can get a good look of these pathetic barbarians. On the square and in Street Hines' Grand Palace, the spiritual spell image projection zoomed in. Soon, they had a clear view of the huge, classy and beautiful spiritual ship in the center of the group. 9 people including Gatinian and the masters and elders of the ancient families were standing on the bow and looking at the distant sky. Their clothes were beautiful and grand, dignified yet not dull, haughty yet not rude. They looked like people from a mysterious and ancient nation with beautiful scenery. Standing at the bow with their white robes fluttered in the wind, these people looked like immortals descending into the mortal world. My goodness. Wow. Are they really barbaric natives? Exclamations rose in the White Pigeon Square. Didn't someone say that they are uncivilized and unruly people wearing filthy clothes like those despicable beings? CIA froze in amazement while covering her little mouth with her hand. Oh, almighty elf god. Beside them, Salah, the young elf girl, was also stupefied, I think. At this moment, they realized that these people who Luther described as uncivilized, dirty, and lowly barbaric natives were completely different from their imagination. Mr. Fang was walking past the White Pigeon Square after having lunch, and he saw this scene. Ye gucking Xu? Damn it. Chapter 594, You Stole All the Thunder. Everyone in Street Hines' Grand Palace was slightly surprised. Of course, even though this scene was unexpected, they continued watching calmly. I think Wilson is preparing the main cannons in the Godly Palace, right? The voice came from the projected image of an old man who wore a pure white priest robe. Obviously, he was a high-level official of the Godly Palace. The moment he said it, 3 hexagonal stone gates opened in the ancient stone palace, revealing 3 black cannon muzzles. Even without firing, they emitted a horrifying suppression. At this moment, several figures flew out of the Grand Palace. The person in the middle was Wilson, the Land of Thorns. He was the powerful existence who had sat in the center of the Grand Palace in a luxurious black robe with golden patterns. The 6 knights were wearing armor of different colors, and the 3 prophets in black spiritual robes flanked him. They floated in midair as if gravity didn't apply to them. "We should give you the most severe godly punishment for your previous sins, Land of Thorns," Wilson said. "Our God is merciful and will give you a chance to redeem yourselves. As long as you hand over the hostages and accept our God's glory, I think the God will forgive you." They were surprised that these barbaric natives dared to come to them, and they would grab this opportunity to realize their goal. As mentioned before, they needed a glorious victory, and subduing the barbaric natives without bloodshed was a good way to achieve this goal. "Oh, what do I see? Are these barbaric natives crazy?" The image turned to another battlefield. At this moment, on the border of Darjin, the Internet Cafe army encountered the Godly Palace Legion, which had conquered the 3 Saint factions and was marching towards the Heavenly Abyss Sea. "No, these barbaric natives are crazy. I feel like the barbaric natives on the other battlefield are going to come to us as well." Luther suddenly changed his tone and said, "Do you think it looks like that they are here to surrender? It's hard to imagine. Instead of wearing armor, their warrior are wearing white clothes. Are they going to a wedding or a ball?" His teasing words made the audience chuckle. However, it was quiet in Street Heinz's Grand Palace. The lofty existences were not a bit disturbed. They only watched and wondered if these barbaric natives were going to surrender. They were certain about the outcome of this war. After all, nothing but pathetic defeat awaits these barbaric natives. What other outcome can there be? Compared to the battlefield at the spiritual state, only one figure flew out of the Godly Palace. He wore fiery red armor and carried a huge sword on his back. While flying high up in the sky, he looked down and said with intense disdain, "Are you here to surrender?" He's the famous Sky Knight, Mr. Hex, the Knight of Furious Flame. Luther introduced. "He's a top-tier master only next to the Morning Star of Burning Flame." Mr. Hex probably thinks that these barbaric natives don't deserve the efforts of Mr. Austin, the Morning Star of Burning Flame. From what I know, there are few level 8 masters on this land, but Mr. Austin has reached level 9. I'm afraid that he can subdue all these barbaric natives all by himself. At this moment, Nalan Hongwu stood on the bow of the spiritual ship, while wearing pure white clothes. His white hair was tied behind his head, and the black longsword on his belt was sheathed. He said mildly, "You should not be here." Instead of using the spiritual state language, he spoke the language of the Outlanders. Besides eating melon and drinking red tea every day in the shop, Jessica and her companions had taught them some spiritual spells, including the language inspiration spell. Ugh. This guy. At this moment, the young people including CIA and Joseph, other warriors and mages, and some members of the Golden Griffin Knight Legion who had been watching the spiritual spell image projection were surprised. They could feel the lofty pride in the succinct words even through the spiritual spell image projection. Damn. This man sounds elegant and has depth. The people watching on the square froze. The elf girl named Salah blinked and wondered, are these natives really barbaric natives? I shouldn't be here. Hex, the Knight of Furious Flame, frowned slightly and suddenly snickered. I think it's you who shouldn't be here. If you're not here to surrender to us, then are you here to seek your death? You use swords? Nalan Hongwu glanced at the huge sword on Hex's back. Hex froze and then said after a long pause, "Are you blind? I carry a sword on my back." "Of course, I use swords," Nalan Hongwu said mildly. "Do you know what the essence of swords is?" These people's words are so deep! At this moment, Salah thought that these people of the continent of immortal relics were mysterious and elegant, instead of being ignorant, filthy, and low as Luther had described. What's happening? At this moment, the lofty existences in Street Heinz Grand Palace were also surprised. Why aren't these people afraid? Instead of being afraid, he even has time to ask about the essence of swords. I think Mr. Klaus, the Sword Saint, will be the best person to answer this question. the old man who was nicknamed the World Mage said. At this moment, Hex said, "The sword in my hand was born to kill enemies of the Judgment Godly Palace. Only sincere people can reach the pinnacle stage of swordsmanship. Insincere people don't deserve to talk about swords." Nalan Hongwu looked at Hex and said, "You're not sincere." Hiss. Salah touched her thin sword on her belt and thought, this old man's words make good sense. Even the knights of the Golden Griffin Knight Legion who were standing around Salah began to see the barbaric natives in a new light. They were surprised that he could speak so wisely. "Damn, you stole all the thunder." Watching the scene behind the crowd, Mr. Fang was speechless. Ha ha. Hex drew out the huge fiery red sword on his back with a cold smile. "If you think that you can talk us out of the war, dream on." Then, his face darkened as he thought, this native isn't even at level 8, and he dares to lecture me? "Do you know what level 8 is?" Hex said slowly, "It's the pinnacle stage for humans." So many years passed, and even this little guy Hex has also reached level 8. In Street Hines' Grand Palace, a projected image said, "I guess he has reached it in recent years. He was baptized in godly power last year. If he borrows the godly power, he can reach level 8, a priest explained. Chapter 595, we might be watching the fake barbaric natives. Well, an inferior swordsman who isn't at level 8 dares to lecture me? Hex said lazily, "Try to take one of my sword strikes, and I'll see if you have the right to give me lectures." With a cold expression, his feet moved slightly in the air. In the next instant, he already appeared before Nalan Hongwu. He hacked down his huge fiery red blade with vicious force. Instant strike. This is Mr. Hex instant strike. Many knights exclaimed on White Pigeon Square. The instant strike that can chop a level 8 magical beast in half. My goodness. However, in the next moment, they saw Nalan Hongwu move his feet slightly, and his body swayed to one side a little bit. The huge blade missed him by a narrow margin. White-haired and white-clothed, Duke Nalan stood where he was with his hands clasped behind his back, looking as if he hadn't moved at all. My goodness. What just happened? Gasps sounded from White Pigeon Square. CIA, Ron, and the other young people covered their mouths with their hands, and they couldn't believe their eyes. How could it be? How did he manage that? Oh, that was amazing. Even the figures hiding in the dark corner of the square were stupefied at this scene. He dodged it. However, this sword strike wasn't over. With a twist of his waist, Hex slashed back his huge sword with horrifying force. However, Nalan Hongwu seemed to have anticipated his move. Almost at the same time when Hex slashed out, Nalan Hongwu began to turn his body. When the sword came, Nalan Hongwu dodged with perfect timing. Everyone on White Pigeon Square was shocked, and their mouths opened in a perfect O shape. Salah, I told you many times. When we're on a mission. Lance walked up with disapproval on his face. No, Captain. Look. Salah pointed at the spiritual spell image projection but couldn't describe what she was seeing. Look where. It's nothing to look at. War? It is just a war. Lance turned his head but froze when he saw the spiritual spell image projection. What did he see? He saw that Hex, the Knight of Furious Flame, couldn't even touch an old man's clothes after using several sword techniques. Who is this guy? Which nation is this Grand Master from? Lance asked immediately. This is. Salah couldn't believe this, and she stared at the battle with widened eyes as she said, he's from another continent. The weak and helpless nation that the Judgment Godly Palace is invading? Lance looked at the projected visuals before him. What did I say? Weak and helpless. How can any weak force be like this? Who's this guy? Lance asked immediately. Is he the most powerful figure among them? In Street Hines' Grand Palace, a priest murmured, is this barbaric native really at level 7? He yelled in his mind. As the Judgment Godly Palace that has all kinds of prophecies and miracles from gods, shouldn't it be our level 6 masters beating up your level 7 masters? But now? Good. Very good. Hex stopped his attacks at this moment and said, I thought that this was a boring expedition and didn't expect to meet anyone who could force me to use my true power. At this time, the miraculous golden pattern on Hex's forehead flashed with dazzling light. Engulfed in the dazzling light, his entire body turned radiant and flashy. A horrifying force spread from his forehead to all over his body. It wasn't a power that humans could have, it seemed to come from gods. Before such horrifying power, anyone would feel humble and tiny. Supported by that horrifying force, Hex hovered in the air, and his golden hair fluttered in the wind. The air around him seemed to be distorted by that terrifying force. Do you see how big the gap between us is? Hex said with a smirk. I'll show you what is true speed. This man in fiery red armor moved his body and suddenly vanished before Nalan Hongwu. In the next moment, he turned into a series of blurry shadow around Nalan Hongwu, moving as fast as the wind. At this moment, Nalan Hongwu looked grim and serious. He could feel that his opponent's strength far surpassed his after that force joined in. This man's strength was so high that it was unclimbable. This gap of strength perhaps couldn't be bridged with skills and techniques. Suddenly, Nalan Hongwu's expression changed, and his body slightly shifted to one side. His opponent's blade drew over his chest, making a smooth cut in his chest. Then, red blood flowed out from the wound. So fast. The audience, on White Pigeon Square, exclaimed again. This speed was inhumane. Like a horrifying fiery red rain of sword energies and meteors, Hex attacked continuously. Could anyone block attacks that were at such high speed? Even grandmasters couldn't detect the movements of the sword, let alone the eyes of ordinary people. On top of that, it was impossible to match such a speed. However, at this moment, Nalan Hongwu's sword slashed out. His sword turned into a black light beam like a black lightning flash. It was fast, but it was no match for his opponent's horrifying speed. Besides, the gap in their strength was too bigger. Before the storm-like sword strikes of his opponent, Nalan Hongwu's black sword looked like a pure light beam. It was so impeccable and pure that it contained no variations in it. Perhaps it just didn't need any variations. When the sword slashed out, blood spewed into the air. At this moment, even some of the existences in Street Hein's Grand Palace stood up subconsciously. The sword saint named Claus also stared at the sword strike intently. If it was said that Hex wasn't using the strength of humans, then this sword strike didn't belong to humans. It was like a sword strike that an immortal used. Although your strength has increased, it isn't your own strength, which means that you can't control it. You will only expose more weaknesses because of it. A sword came from the west, flying immortal beyond the heavens. Even if he couldn't fully understand it, any bit of inspiration was crucial. Nalan Hongwu might not have reached that realm, but he had seen it and obtained some inspirations from it. His sword had almost reached that perfect realm. Ah! These people of this mysterious and ancient nation are elegant and powerful, and their swordsmanship is philosophical and poetic. This was the impression that these barbaric natives left on the minds of the people of the Laura continent. Are we really looking at the barbaric natives? Chapter 596. Battle. The spiritual spell visual projection came from a crystal ball sitting on a base, with magic power flowing inside. The mist above the crystal ball revealed a huge screen with scenes in the battlefields on the continent of immortal relics. These were all provided by the godly palace in Kanglan City. Sometimes, it would show some projected visuals of masters fighting in mystic realms. Did you see that sword technique clearly? With borrowed horrifying godly power, Hex created a curtain of sword shadows with blazing flames, but his attacks were shattered by one clear sword slash from his opponent. The knights, elves, warriors, mages, and young people of the Morning Light Empire on the White Pigeon Square were shocked. How come this is different from the battles that we watched before? With Hex's terrifying speed, strength, and flames that are empowered by godly power, he can easily fight 10,000 warriors alone. But you guys destroyed all that with a sword strike. Something is wrong. It didn't make sense. They were stupefied with shock and disbelief. This battle turned their understanding of battles upside down. This sword slash looked random and didn't make sense, but true masters knew its power and the outcome before it landed. They saw a horrifying control of strength after everything at that moment was known to Nalan Hongwu. He didn't need eyes to see and ears to hear to achieve this granular control. Seeing a tiny movement from his opponent, such as a shift of a foot or a wave of a sword, Nalan Hongwu would instantly know how to use the next sword strike. Regardless of how fast Hex moved around Nalan Hongwu and which angle he attacked from, Nalan Hongwu would use a perfect sword strike to counter. I'm surprised. The projected image of an old man who was emitting radiant light said, Mr. Street Hines, we might not be able to win the war as easily as we expected. Obviously, Hex lost this battle due to his opponent's superb combat skills. The old man who was nicknamed the World Mage said, but I'm not worried. After all, skills take hundreds of years to master but can't extend people's lifespan or strengthen their force. It takes everything backward. This old man has lived hundreds of years but only reached level 7. I'm afraid that he's in the last years of his life. Powerful strength could extend one's lifespan. With prolonged life, people could cultivate and reach higher realms. These people also practiced skills, but in their eyes, skills were just auxiliary abilities while one obtained more strength. After all, one couldn't block a destructive spiritual spell with only techniques. It was why these forces were called godly nations and godly palaces while the Morning Light Empire, the nation of skills, was only an empire. Oh, Mr. Hex was so careless. At this moment, Luther hurried to explain. Believe me, it was just an accident. For layman, it indeed looked like an accident. In the spiritual spell visual projection, Luther continued, I hope that others won't repeat the careless mistake that Mr. Hex made. Anyway, these barbaric natives are not good for nothing. Yes, that's what has happened. These barbaric natives are fearless. Maybe they think that their good luck will continue? Luther said viciously. I think we must teach them a lesson. Was it just an accident? Oh, no. Naive elf girl Salah began to worry again. Obviously, Mr. Hex was defeated too easily. A knight of the Golden Griffin Knight Legion said, I, too, think that it was just an accident. Don't you think so, Ms. Helen? Helen answered distractedly, maybe. Even if his victory had an element of luck, he is still very powerful since he could defeat the mighty Mr. Hex. CIA argued. At this moment, the audience, on White Pigeon Square, were divided into several groups with different opinions. The Knights of the Night Legion thought that the barbaric natives wouldn't be so lucky anymore. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to rescue Miss Jessica and the others. The group led by Elf Girl Salah thought that there might be an element of luck in the victory, but they believed that the battle was won with some high-level techniques. While these people argued, Luther changed the scene of the spiritual spell visual projection. They had set one end of the spiritual spell visual projection in each of the 3 battlefields, and Luther could choose any of them to show to the audience. Obviously, he had seen something he liked on another battlefield and immediately changed the scene. It was something that the Godly Palace wanted to show to the audience as well. Oh, look! Mr. Land of Thorns has ordered a full-scale charge on the barbaric natives who are determined to resist us. But this time, they won't be so lucky. They could see white godly light transform into destructive light beams while they crashed down from the sky. Pale blue lights lit up around the spiritual ships of spiritual state cultivators. When the white godly light beams crashed onto the pale blue spiritual lights around the spiritual ships, the ships shook violently under the huge force. Meanwhile, the spiritual state began to fight back. While artifact masters in Jua City and Half City were busy preparing, the cultivators of the spiritual state hadn't been idle. At the end of the Legend of the Sword and Fairy, Li Xiaoyao returned to Shu Mountain faction and studied many things from the ancient scrolls. With the artifact making and array planning methods that they learned from the game, The cultivators strengthened and improved the defensive and offensive arrays on their spiritual ships. Since the ancient families on the spiritual state were the most powerful forces on this continent, they were not at an obvious disadvantage in this battle. Meanwhile, many warriors riding all kinds of mounts flew out from the huge stone palace in the sky like locusts, dashing in all directions. Instantly, they almost filled the whole sky and blocked out most of the light. Behind the riders were rows of white-robed mages who were hovering in the sky. The most eye-catching were fire-spitting huge dragons which looked like the horned dragons that Gabriel and the others rode, but these beasts were fiercer than horned dragons. Of course, there were other rare beasts as well. One golden-armored knight was riding a magnificent lion with wings. This knight didn't attack. Instead, he watched the battle quietly from the high sky. At the order of the golden-armored knight, the locust-like legion of knights swept down from the sky like a huge gloomy cloud under the cover of many godly light beams. Chapter 597. The furious roars of 8 million fighters. Before them, the ice city had disappeared. Only their worst nightmare hovered high in the sky above the snowy ultimate west realm. Hellbringers of the Black Dragon family, do you dare to come with me and kill all of them? At this moment, a horned dragon soared up into the sky, and Gabriel raised his huge sword and roared, "We Hellbringers are unrivaled. Attack!" Before the others could answer, a warrior of the spiritual state dashed out with red eyes. Although this war was waged in the ultimate west realm, it wasn't directed only at this place. The people here were only the earliest victims of this war. If the ultimate west realm was lost, the next would be the spiritual state or the entire continent of immortal relics. Attack! Furious roars could be heard despite the howling of violent gusts in the sky. The cultivators of the spiritual state had had little dealings with warriors of the ultimate west realm, but seeing the devastation of the land and the ruined city, the brave character of the spiritual state burned with fury as their blood boiled. After all, they lived on the same continent, and they guarded another continent in a virtual world together. Instantly, at least 1,000 people charged into the enemies engulfed by raining light beams. Where are the Grandmasters? As a Grandmaster player, Xuanhuan raised his fist and yelled, "Where are the Silent Eyes?" Zhongwu roared, and all the Silent Eye players on the spiritual ships answered him. A sword may conquer the flesh, but only your heart may conquer the mind. My eyes are in deep sleep, and my heart is my new eye. Not only slayers but all other classes including noblesses, dragon fists, and swift masters joined the fight. Many figures swarmed out like a terrifying wave from the spiritual ships. Space-time cutter shatters the world. Every creature is a tiny ant under the sword. Radiant gunfire. Rain of 3,000 bullets. Gales. Move at my order. Charge. Where are my 8 million fighters? For some time now, a legend about 8 million fighters in Dungeon Fighter Online had been circulating around the shops. TL note, this is a reference to DFO in China. At its peak, there were 8 million concurrent players on the servers. Although there were only tens of thousands of players, when Zhongwu flew across the sky and let out a furious roar, many resonant shouts answered him, and it sounded like a tsunami. The world shook as if everything in the world was terrified by this force. While the Night Legion of the Thornflower family from the Judgment Godly Palace swarmed down like dark clouds, the huge army of fighters of the spiritual state surged up like turbulent waves in the ocean. The fighters of the Ultimate West Realm were the first to charge, but the demon clan of the Snow Nation, who moved later, overtook them. Crown Prince Jiangxuan pierced a Knight of Judgment Godly Palace with his black patterned treasure sword. The spiritual spell visual projection of the Judgment Godly Palace zoomed out, and the audience could only see many people flying across the sky like ants. They could distinctly see that two groups of spiritual state fighters plunged into their enemies. These people aren't afraid of being killed? Luther was struck by fear while watching the battle through the spiritual spell visual projection. Surrounded by many enemies, Gabriel seemed to have forgotten about death, and his armor was covered in ugly wounds. In the grand palace that was hovering in the sky, a chained figure was pushed out on a cart, and this dying man was revealed to be their lord. Attack! At this moment, even the mild-tempered Liu Peeling roared in fury. Xuanhuan slashed out his sword and shot out giant spiritual swords one after another, sending groups of knights flying. A series of roars sounded around him. Mountain-shattering strike. Saber-drawing hack. Fierce dragon sky strike. In the chaotic battle, sword energies looked like lightning flashes while sword lights flashed in the sky. The fierce and violent techniques seemed to have triggered TNT and caused an explosion in the middle of people. In tattered armor and with a hole through his belly, Gabriel leapt down from his horned dragon. Then, he charged toward the direction of the Grand Palace without fear. This man. Is he truly not afraid of death? Not only Luther, but many figures in Street Hein's Grand Palace intently stared at this figure on the battlefield. Covered in blood and with a few grey mysterious crystals in hand, Gabriel leapt up and landed on the huge black dragon that was ridden by a knight who was wearing luxurious golden armor. Dirith. Even from the distance, the audience could clearly see the blood-covered figure among the legion of knights of the Thornflower family. What are we seeing? This madman dashed to Dirith, one of the most powerful elite members of the Thornflower family. Besides the 6 knights and the 3 people wearing black priest robes who were all standing motionlessly high in the sky, the man wearing golden armor was the most eye-catching figure here. You are asking for it? Dirith's face darkened, surprised that this severely injured man dared to charge at him. I'll take your head then. Dirith hacked out with his huge sword. Boom! Gabriel blocked it with his sword, but the huge momentum and the sword technique allowed his opponent's giant sword to almost chop off his shoulder. The huge sword was stuck in his bones. Now, Dirith could only see the attacker's blood-red eyes. The crazy eyes looked like that of a demon. Then, he saw the madman taking a vicious step forward. Fury exploded. Violent and bloody presence exploded like a huge cannonball. Dirith felt a violent force crashing onto his body like a huge mountain-shattering hammer. Instantly, he was engulfed by the horrifying blood-red fury energy. Impossible. Many people exchanged a look of horror after seeing this scene and that figure who was covered in blood. Like raindrops and locusts, people fell from the sky at every moment, but most of them were knights of the Thornflower family. In the close-range battles, the combat force of these people, who they saw as barbaric natives, far surpassed their imaginations. Seeing this scene, Luther was at a loss for words. Meanwhile, Street Heinz still looked indifferent and cold. Because, at this moment, Luther received the order to change the screen to another spiritual spell visual projection. Meanwhile, the man who was called Land of Thorns and was wearing a luxurious black robe waved his hand and said, "Unleash the Dark Judgment Legion." A puff of black smoke appeared beside him and then condensed into a man who was hidden in black armor. Land of Thorns stared at the battlefield coldly and saw that no knights dared to get close to Xuanhuan. He pointed at Xuanhuan and made the cutthroat gesture. The man in black armor beside him instantly vanished. Chapter 598, With my real eyes gone, my mind's eye opens. At this moment, the spiritual spell visual projection that was shown to the general public had turned to another scene, but the people in Street Hein's Grand Palace could watch whatever they liked and didn't need to follow the public. The spiritual spell visual projection before them still showed the battlefield in the Ultimate West realm. It seems that Mr. Heinz has underestimated them this time. Ha ha ha. The middle-aged man wearing a luxurious fiery red robe and a tall hat sat across from Heinz. Anyway, this war isn't boring anymore. At this moment, even the princess sitting beside Street Heinz didn't look bored, but her tone was still lazy. But the Thornflower family must show one of their hidden cards now. Obviously, she knew about the hidden cards of the forces under the Judgment Godly Palace. The moment she said that, they saw the Land of Thorns sending out the Dark Judgment Legion. As mentioned before, there were professions similar to the assassins of the Underground Council. For example, some forces trained and kept scouts and killers. They used these forces to handle things that they wanted to keep secret. The Dark Judgment Legion was one of such forces. The Thornflower family had trained this force for a long time. The team consisted of 3 level 8 Dark Judgment Knight captains who acted as leaders and 12 level 7 Dark Judgment Knights. This time, the Thornflower family brought 2 Dark Judgment Knight captains and 6 level 7 Dark Judgment Knights to this war. It meant that the Thornflower family brought more than half of its military force to this war on the continent of Immortal Relics, showing their determination to win. Due to the blockage at the Heavenly Abyss Sea, they couldn't move some powerful weapons into this land, which was another reason why they brought such powerful legions with them. However, they were very confident in the abilities of their legions. On the battlefield where fierce fights went on, Xuanhuan waved his sword, which wasn't long but emitted bright lights, overpowering most of his enemies. Most people couldn't handle his strikes. However, at this moment, a streak of extremely strange presences floated into the sky above the battlefield. He looked around carefully but couldn't see anything unusual, as if he was having a hallucination. An old man wearing a white priest robe and a white hat said slowly, disguised in shadows, "They judge and remove all sins." This barbaric native is not aware of the danger, which means that the Dark Judgment Knight Legion will take another soul. These barbaric natives don't know that they are as bright as lights in the dark night to the Thornflower family, and they themselves are blind in the darkness. The moment he said it, they saw Xuanhuan, who was battling one knight, suddenly stop pursuing his opponent for some reason. Then, he moved to one side confidently. A pitch-black dagger slashed across the space before Xuanhuan's chest. Then, a figure appeared before him silently while the dagger slashed down extremely close to Xuanhuan's chest, cutting open the pure white robe near the location of his heart. If Xuanhuan had dodged a little bit slower, it was obvious what would have happened! Instantly, the old man who had spoken smugly in Street Hein's Grand Palace was embarrassed, and his face turned red as if someone had slapped him. He dodged it? They all froze in their eyes. This native warrior was at most in the pinnacles stage of level 7 and not level 8 yet. However, the assassin who went after him was a level 8 master. An level 8 master can't assassinate a level 7 master? Could it be? They immediately thought of Hex in the previous battle. Could it be that this barbaric native warrior has the same combat techniques as the barbaric native in the previous battle? However, Street Hines and Land of Thorns Wilson both looked cold and unmoved by this. Land of Thorns Wilson had sent over more than one Dark Judgment Knight. 2 level 8 knights and 3 level 7 knights were here to deal with Xuanhuan. One of the 2 level 8 fighters must borrow godly power to reach this level, but the other had reached this realm with his own strength. In contrast, Xuanhuan was only at the pinnacle stage of level 7. The moment Xuanhuan dodged the attack, he suddenly felt a chilly presence coming at his neck. Without thinking, he took 2 steps back. Chilliness touched his neck, and a tiny line of blood appeared. If the dagger cut a little deeper, it would have slit open his throat. Cold sweat trickled down from Xuanhuan's forehead. At this moment, he felt tremendous pressure coming from the sneak attacks and the invisible enemies. There was more than one assassin. The moment Xuanhuan narrowly dodged the attack that was aiming for his throat, he felt an intense murderous spirit coming from behind. He quickly bent forward, and he ducked, dodging 2 pitch-black daggers which swept into the air just above his back. Before he could breathe, 2 deadly black blades shot toward his rib cage from the 2 sides. Xuanhuan didn't even feel the movement of air around him. In the spiritual spell visual projection, they saw Xuanhuan was attacked from all directions by the strikes from shadows. The pitch-black daggers flashed toward him silently. Despite his swift dodges, several wounds appeared on Xuanhuan's body. Blood dripped out drop by drop. It was a terrifying sight. Hee. A series of laughter came from the void. It sounded like this person was mocking him. A man wearing black armor stood in the void not far from Xuanhuan, but no one could see him, including Xuanhuan. They hid in the shadows. They were killers in the darkness. Obviously, it seemed like Xuanhuan couldn't last much longer. The Dark Judgment Knights, The existences hiding in shadows retreated. They didn't leave. Instead, they were preparing for the next wave of storm-like attacks to get the kill. It seemed like a desperate presence was born in the peace before the storm. Castellan Zong? Standing on the spiritual ship, Zhang Hao, the Vice Academy Master of Heavenly Academy, turned grim at the scene and was about to fly over and help. In the blink of an eye, a knight blocked him. This knight was one of the 6 knights who had been watching the battle outside the godly palace and didn't move before. "You are seeking death." The Tang family master had just dashed out when another knight flew down from the high sky and blocked his path. Obviously, no one could come to Zhongwu's rescue. When the Dark Judgment Knights moved, they must return with their enemies' heads. Land of Thorns Wilson was playing with a ruby ring on his finger. He glanced this way at the battle with a sneer on his face. Obviously, he had expected the interference of these people and had been prepared. Even if you have insane techniques, you can't use them in such a situation. Seeing this scene, Hematon, the world mage, nodded and said, "It's why I said that practicing techniques is attending to trifles and neglecting essentials." The moment he said it, they saw Zhongwu taking out a black band. Under the astonished gazes of everyone in Street Hein's Grand Palace, he covered his eyes with the band. What's he going to do? At this moment, only the Shadow Killer noticed the great difference in Zhongwu, the barbaric native warrior who had been at their mercy. With my real eyes gone, my mind's eye opens. Suddenly, the Dark Judgment Knights sensed a powerful and solid murderous spirit sweeping toward and corroding their bodies like pervasive chilly air. Murderous Wave. Chapter 599. Sorry, I can't fight without being blind. What is he doing? Is he surrendering? Covering his eyes during the battle, no one had seen such a method before. By doing this, it felt like this man had delivered himself to his enemies with his hands and feet tied. In the high sky covered by gloomy clouds, cold winds swept across the snowy land of the ultimate West Realm. They saw the warrior who they regarded as a barbaric native holding a short saber emitting radiant spiritual light in his hand. With his eyes covered by the black band, he stood in the air quietly, letting the gusts flutter his robe against his body. Right now, he looked like a weak old man who had given up resistance. A weird presence floated past him. One must look very closely to see a trace of darkness with the same color as the gloomy sky floating in the air. Completely silent, they seemed like ghosts who were hiding in the dark night. A dangerous aura started to spread while 4 pitch-black daggers shot towards Zhongwu's vital parts from 4 directions. This time, the attacks were faster and more vicious. However, before their daggers came close, a strange white shadow rose behind Zhongwu. This attack appeared at the perfect moment, as if he had anticipated their attacks instead of being sneak attacked. These assassins didn't know that in Zhongwu's mind, their intense murderous spirit and energy waves hidden in the dark were as obvious as bright lights in darkness. In the dark world that existed in Zhongwu's senses, the energy waves behind him moved more violently. Azure wave radiation. Before the explosion reached them, the existences hiding in the shadows felt like they were struck by turbulent waves. A huge force sent them flying forward as if a volcano had erupted. They found that they were shaken out of the shadows by the weird force, and they were completely exposed to the whole world. On top of that, they discovered that a powerful suction force drew them together. The attack didn't end there. This was only the beginning. While they were shaken out of their stealth and lost their balances, they saw that Zhongwu slashed out his short sword, which transformed into several surges of huge and invisible spiritual swords, leaving them no space to dodge. They were shocked. Under the influence of the Heavenly Academy, warriors of the spiritual state mostly focused on the cultivation of chi. Long-range attacks with sword energies such as Spirit Crescent were not difficult for them. They could use them without much practice since they had similar techniques before. Obviously, there were experts in different fields. Zhongwu is a master in this area. Otherwise, he wouldn't have mastered these techniques so soon. Zhongwu slashed out his short sword, and a heated red flame shot out, following the trajectory of many ice blades. The ice and fire mingled, bursting into a wave of radiant sword energies in the sky. Spirit crescent, ice wave sword, fire wave sword. The sword slashed out, and its great sword energies instantly condensed into a huge saber, followed by the ultimate combat techniques that Xuanhuan mastered. Many surges of horrifying sword energies instantly engulfed the area where the assassins were. Everyone watching the battle stared at the scene in astonishment. With his eyes covered and strange light runes rotating around him, this barbaric native warrior had transformed his murderous spirit into visible lights that were emitting from his body. He looked like an Asura who was standing high in the heavens. Instantly, 4 of the elite Dark Judgment Knights died. The Dark Judgment Knights who came to this war lost half of their forces. The remaining 4 knights found that they were each chased by a surge of sword energy. With great precision, each sword energy followed its target unerringly regardless of how they tried to dodge. The lofty audience in Street Hein's Grand Palace watched as the Dark Judgment Knights were being hunted down by the barbaric native whose eyes were covered. Covered in pitch-black light armor, they exposed nothing but their eyes to the air. With short swords or daggers in hand, they emitted chilly and deadly presence. With your eyes covered, how did you do this? The Shadow Killer stared at Xuanhuan intently. He couldn't imagine how his opponent had blocked his killing strike. He was infuriated most by the fact that they had suppressed this man while his eyes were open, but they were now pressured by him while his eyes were covered. You mean this? While stroking his beard, Xuanhuan thought for a moment and said, I've played as a blind man for such a long time that I don't know how to fight with my eyes open. Puh. The Shadow Killer spewed out a mouthful of blood. The high-level officials of Judgment Godly Palace sitting in Street Hein's Grand Palace were at a loss for words. They were livid, and their faces almost turned green. This barbaric native, reckless, absolutely reckless. A white-robed priest yelled furiously. Street Heinz stared at the battlefield coldly. Obviously, the Thornflower family was more powerful than this. Only the Thornflower family master had more hidden cards than what these barbaric natives could imagine. Inhaling deeply, Street Heinz turned his eyes to another battlefield. He had waited for the Dark Judgment Knights of the Thornflower family to come up with better hidden cards. But now, he decided to ignore them to not feel agitated. In fact, some of the classes in Dungeon Fighter Online didn't have so many restrictions as they seemed to have. For example, Berserkers, a subclass of male slayers, looked normal on usual occasions. However, when they got furious, excited, or were experiencing a mental collapse, they would turn into crazy demons and obtain great power at the price of blood. At this moment, on another battlefield, Gabriel had almost dashed onto the Stone Palace all by himself. At the entrance in the center of the Stone Palace, Land of Thorns was only flanked by 1 knight and 1 black-robed prophet. Look at this guy. He has reached his limit after sending Derith flying. But now, he is seeking death by coming to a Sky Knight. This black-armored knight was also riding a huge dragon which was much larger and fiercer than Gabriel's horned dragon. Chapter 600. How come we can't watch the battles? This man was brown-haired and about 50 years old. He said with intense disdain in his eyes, "Little guy, you shouldn't have come here." The moment he said it, Gabriel raised his blood-covered right hand before him and opened his fingers. While his fingers opened, a blood-colored vortex began to slowly take shape. The moment the blood-colored vortex was formed, the black-armored knight suddenly felt that the huge dragon beneath him was flying toward Gabriel against its will. Bloody twister. The horrifying blood-colored vortex could immobilize anything and seal any force before it. If anything were sucked into it, there was no getting away. You are seeking death. As a lofty Sky Knight, this black-armored knight was furious that he was challenged by a young man who had barely reached level 7. He slashed out his sword viciously, and a huge sword energy flew out, intending to cut Gabriel into 2 halves. Light Shadow Strike. Another sword energy crashed down from the sky and smashed into the sword energy unleashed by the black-armored knight. Colorless crystal dust scattered in the wind, and the grey dust seemed to show the world what a powerful force it had unleashed. Sire and Liu Peeling had battled their way to this place as well. Boom! The ripples of the surging sword energy spread out like a storm, and a bloody light struck down with vicious force as strong winds blew by. As a sad howl sounded, the skull of the huge dragon that the black-armored knight was riding on was shattered by the powerful strike, and blood sprayed everywhere. "You are seeking your deaths." Looking extremely dignified with the huge sword in his hand, the black-armored knight activated the golden patterns between his eyebrows as he shouted, "You dare to challenge me? Godly Punisher roared. You'll be turned into ashes by the godly light." He was the best out of the 6 Sky Knights. If he borrowed godly power, he could reach level 9. The horrifying force spread out. Even the ground couldn't withstand this force and cracked open. Good, good. In the Grand Palace, the lofty existences nodded repeatedly and said, "This little guy has also reached level 9? They dare to come to this place. These barbaric natives will pay for their audacity." An old man wearing a priest robe said mildly, "I seem to foresee these ignorant barbaric natives being crushed like ants." However, the moment he said it, a middle-aged man in a bright blue robe floated over with a thick scroll in his hands. On the chest of his robe was an embroidered golden cross. He asked, "Godly power?" Although the Ultimate West realm mainly produced warriors, it didn't mean that there weren't any cultivators among them. The cultivator chanted in a low voice, and faint lights began to emit from these warriors' weapons. "Valor blessing." Then, another light fell on Gabriel's head. "Blessing of dawn." This wasn't the end. Soon, they saw another light landing on Gabriel's head. "Revenge of light." Then, Archangel's blessing. "Source of life." "Wind of holy healing." Lights flashed on Gabriel, Liu Peeling, and Sire one after another. When the middle-aged man stopped chanting the blessings with a cross in his hands, the 3 gathered and emitted extremely powerful presences. "May the holy light bless you." With a long chant, the middle-aged man in the bright blue robe finally finished casting spells. "What's this?" Everyone stared at the scene dumbfoundedly. Where did these barbaric natives get this stuff? With a furious roar, Gabriel closed his left hand, and the congealed blood slowly moved down his arm and condensed into a new sword in his hand. With an unintelligible roar, this fighter who was only at level 7 charged toward the knight who had reached level 9 with the help of godly power. With everything of the warriors of Ultimate West Realm, attack! Sire and Liu Peeling roared and charged forward viciously. These people's battle roars seemed to ignite the fire on the whole battlefield. Let's turn to another battlefield that we haven't watched yet. Luther finally turned the spiritual spell visual projection to the battlefield in the Morning Star Sea realm, but they were astonished by what they saw. The cultivator army of the Morning Star Sea realm had begun fighting the Outland army in close range. A woman wearing a green dress strolled on the battlefield as if she was taking a walk, and before her was a level 8 golden armored knight. The moment the golden armored knight struck out his sword, the audience saw a white light flash by. Then, a destructive and demonic power erupted. Release plus devil trigger. In the blink of an eye, this woman withdrew the demonic power, and the level 8 knight looked as if a truck that weighed several tons had run over his body. He died instantly. Oh, this is impossible. The spiritual spell visual projection was instantly turned to another direction. A series of hysterical laughter resonated on the battlefield. A woman had transformed her murderous spirit into a sharp saber while demonic shadows danced behind her. The murderous spirit that only belonged to demons permeated the whole battlefield. Blood splashed into the air while the saber danced around. One knight fell to the ground after another like harvested wheat straws. The demonic power had been Shui Xuanhuan's nightmare, but it was now her greatest source of power. Meanwhile, not far from her, a figure in a black robe flew up into the air. Below him, blood gushed out, turning the ground into a pool of blood. The blood turned into tornadoes and sharp blades, even making this place into a horrifying bloody hell. Many terrifying techniques of blood, ice, and flames spread out on the battlefield like lotuses made of blood and fire. They looked demonic but extremely dazzling. Oh, no, this can't be real. Seeing this, Luther stammered and then immediately turned the spiritual spell visual projection to another battlefield. This time, he finally found something to his liking. In the spiritual spell visual projection, several civilian warriors of the Geocity shop were at the disadvantage as they were surrounded by several powerful knights armed with excellent weapons. It seemed like they couldn't last long. Oh, look! There are indeed some grandmasters among the barbaric natives, but their overall strength is not great. While holding a cup of tea in his hand, Luther felt like his lips were so dry that they were about to crack. The moment he said it, a dark sword light flashed by. Sitting on White Pigeon Square, Salah, CIA, and the others saw a short-haired young man who was about 30 years old. This man was holding a strange sword with dazzling lights. A sword energy flashed, looking like a huge dragon's mouth. Raging dragon slash. The knights who had been attacking the civilian warriors were sent flying high into the sky. It seemed like they had been hit by a train. Blacklight Grandmaster. He's Blacklight Grandmaster. One of the civilian warriors yelled in pleasant surprise. The short-haired young man lifted the lightsaber and roared, "Friends, grab your weapons and kick out the invaders." Luther spat out his tea. Water splashed onto the spiritual spell visual projection. Then, it turned black. "Hey! Elf girl!" Salah stood up and shouted, "How come you stopped the visual projection?" "Ah!" A few other elves also stood up. Even the two assassins hiding in the darkness were also frustrated. "We are enjoying it. How come it was turned off?"